You are a woman in the year 1830, standing in the cold morning light of a market square in Yorkshire. The cobblestones beneath your worn boots are slick with frost, and your breath forms small clouds in the air as you hear the murmur of voices growing louder around you. But this isn't excitement. It's something else entirely. Something that makes your stomach twist with a peculiar mix of dread and desperate hope. Around your neck you feel the rough scratch of rope, a halter like the ones used for livestock. Your husband's calloused hand grips the other end, and his voice carries across the square with the practiced tone of someone selling a prized cow. "What am I bid for this fine woman?" he calls out, his words slurring slightly from the ale he drank at dawn to steady his nerves. Strong back, good teeth, can cook and mend. The crowd gathers closer. Their faces a mixture of curiosity, disgust, and calculation. Some men step forward to examine you like they would a horse at auction, checking your hands for calluses that prove you can work, looking at your face to judge if you're comely enough to warm their bed. You stand there, heart pounding, knowing that in the next few minutes, your entire life will change. You might end up with a kinder man than the one who brought you here. Or you might find yourself in an even worse situation. But here's what terrifies you most. This isn't illegal. This isn't some back-alley crime or desperate act of madness. This is, in the twisted logic of your time, your best chance at freedom, your only chance at divorce. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The practice we call wife selling wasn't born from cruelty alone, though cruelty certainly played its part. It emerged from a legal system so rigid and unforgiving that it left the poor with no other options. To understand why hundreds of Victorian men led their wives to market squares with halters around their necks, we need to step into a world where women weren't people, they were property. In Victorian England, the legal doctrine of coverture meant that when a woman married, her very identity disappeared. As the renowned legal scholar Sir William Blackstone wrote in 1753, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least is consolidated and incorporated into that of her husband. She became what the law called a femme covert, a covered woman, hidden beneath her husband's legal identity, like she was wearing an invisibility cloak. Picture Mary Thompson, a fictional but typical working-class woman of the 1820s. Before marriage, she could own property, sign contracts, and even sue someone in court. But the moment she spoke her wedding vows, everything changed. Her wages belonged to her husband. Any inheritance from her parents became his. If she started a small business selling bread or taking in washing, every penny she earned was legally his property. Even her clothes, the very dress on her back, belonged to him. If Mary's husband, let's call him William, decided to beat her until she couldn't stand, the law offered little protection. A man had the right to correct his wife, just as he might discipline a child or train a dog. If he drank away their rent money or gambled their food budget, she had no legal recourse. If he brought home diseases from brothels or refused to work while she took in laundry until her fingers bled, the law saw this as his prerogative as head of household. But what happened when Mary couldn't take it anymore? What happened when William's correction left her with broken ribs, or when his drinking meant their children went to bed hungry every night? What happened when she met someone else, perhaps a kind widower who treated her with respect, or a bachelor who offered genuine affection? In the upper classes there was divorce, but it was so expensive and complicated it might as well have been reserved for royalty. Before 1857, getting a divorce required a private Act of Parliament, a process that cost at least £1,000, equivalent to about £118,000 today. That sum represented more money than most working-class families would see in a lifetime. Even after the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 made divorce slightly more accessible through the courts, it still cost around £40 more than a labourer's yearly wages. For the poor, there were really only 5 ways to end a marriage. You could separate by mutual agreement, though this left both parties unable to remarry legally. You could desert, simply disappear one day and hope your spouse didn't track you down. You could try to get a legal separation through the church courts on grounds of adultery or life-threatening cruelty, but this was expensive and didn't allow remarriage. You could die, which given the living conditions of the working class wasn't entirely uncommon. Or you could sell your wife. The practice emerged sometime in the late 17th century, probably born from desperation and reinforced by folk belief. Since the law treated women as property, some reasoned, why couldn't that property be transferred like any other? The ritual that developed was both humiliating and strangely dignified, a grotesque parody of both divorce and remarriage wrapped into one public ceremony. The selling typically began with an advertisement in the local newspaper. These ads read like livestock auctions. John Smith will sell his wife Mary at Doncaster Market on Tuesday next. She is healthy, strong, and of good character. No reasonable offer refused. Sometimes the ads were more personal. Thomas Brown, being tired of his wife, will dispose of her to any person willing to take her off his hands. She can wash, cook, and milk cows. On the appointed day, the husband would lead his wife to a public place, usually a market square where livestock was normally sold, though sometimes a tavern or public house served the purpose. The symbolism was deliberate and devastating. The wife wore a halter around her neck, arm, or waist, usually made of rope but sometimes of ribbon, in a pathetic attempt at dignity. This halter wasn't just symbolic, it marked her as property to be transferred, no different from a cow or sheep. The auctioneer, often the husband himself, would call for bids. What am I offered for this fine woman? She's 26 years old, can bear children, excellent at needlework, and has all her teeth. The crowd would press closer, men examining the woman like potential buyers at a horse fair. They'd check her hands for signs of hard work, look at her face to judge her attractiveness, sometimes even ask her to speak to test her manners. But here's where the historical record reveals something crucial that changes our understanding of these scenes. In most cases, the sale was arranged in advance. The buyer was often the woman's lover, and the sale was actually a form of consensual divorce and remarriage rolled into one public ceremony. The humiliation was real, but it served a purpose. It made the separation publicly witnessed, and in the minds of participants legally binding. Consider the case documented in Brighton in 1826, one of the real incidents that inspired Thomas Hardy's famous novel The Mayor of Casterbridge. A man led his tidy-looking woman to market and sold her for £5 to a sailor. The newspaper reported that she seemed nothing loath to go, and that the transaction was conducted with every appearance of good humour. The sailor had likely been courting her for months, and all three parties saw the sale as their only way to legally end one relationship and begin another. In Wenlock Market in 1830, a wife sold for 2 shillings, and 6pence was determined that the transaction should proceed, despite her husband's last-minute doubts. She flipped her a pern in her goodman's face and said, "Let be your rogue, I will be sold. I wants a change." Her voice carries across the centuries, determined, fierce, seizing what little agency the law allowed her. The prices paid varied wildly, from a high of £100 plus £25 for each child, in today's money, over £18,000, to as little as a glass of ale. Most sales fell between 2 shillings and 6pence to 5 shillings, roughly equivalent to 20.50 today, but the money wasn't really the point. What mattered was the public nature of the transaction, witnessed by dozens or sometimes hundreds of people who could later testify that the woman had been legally transferred from one man to another. The halter itself held deep symbolic meaning. After the sale was complete, it was handed to the new husband as proof that the transaction was finished. This wasn't just theatre, it was a desperate attempt to create legal validity where none existed. The participants needed to believe, and to convince their community, that what they were doing was legitimate. Sometimes the ritual grew more elaborate. Bills of sale were drawn up and signed, with language borrowed from real property transfers. I, John Parsons, for, and in consideration of the sum of £6 and 6 shillings in hand paid, do sell, assign, and set over unto John Tooker, Ann Parsons, wife of the said John Parsons, with all right, property, claim, services and demands whatsoever, during the term of the natural life of her, the said Ann Parsons. The ceremony often ended with all parties going to the nearest pub for a wedding feast, paid for by the new husband. Church bells might even ring, as they did in one documented case from 1827. The community, starved for entertainment and drama, treated these occasions as public spectacles. Crowds of hundreds might gather, treating the sale like a combination of theatre, court proceeding, and carnival. But not every wife sale was a consensual arrangement between lovers seeking legitimacy. Some were genuine auctions where women found themselves bid upon by strangers. In March 1766, a carpenter from Southwark sold his wife in a fit of conjugal indifference at the alehouse. When he sobered up and asked her to return, she refused, and he hanged himself. The desperation that drove both the sale and its aftermath speaks to the impossible situations these legal restrictions created. In 1824 in Manchester, A wife was knocked down for 5 shillings, but not liking the purchaser, she was put up again for 3 shillings and a quart of ale. The woman's voice mattered. She could refuse buyers she found unsuitable. But imagine the terror of standing there while strangers bid on you like livestock, knowing that your future depended on which of these men was willing to pay the most. The practice was particularly strong in Yorkshire, where 27 of the 108 documented Victorian-era wife sales took place. In May 1837, a blacksmith named Garth in Halifax first sold his wife for 1 shilling, then bought her back, then resold her to a married man for half a crown. When the wife came in on learning the fact, she responded by mauling her faithless spouse rather severely, a detail that suggests she hadn't consented to any of these transactions. The most elaborate sales could draw enormous crowds. In December 1849 in Goole, when a man named Ashton discovered his wife had eloped with her lover while he was in hospital, he tracked them down and arranged a public sale. The Yorkshire crowd gathered to watch as the buxom young woman was sold to her paramour for 5 shillings and 9 pence, after a little spirited competition. Before leaving with her new partner, she snapped her fingers at her ex-husband and declared, "There, good for naught, that's more than you would fetch." Even children weren't exempt from this trade. Wives were sometimes sold with their children included in the price, like accessories to the main purchase. In 1865, a woman and her 2 children sold for £100 plus £25 each for the children, a sum that represented several years' wages for a working man. The buyer was taking on not just a wife but an entire family, with all the financial responsibilities that entailed. The authorities' response to wife selling was inconsistent and often confused. Legally, the practice had no basis in law. It was essentially a conspiracy to commit adultery, followed by bigamy, when the new couples married. But many local officials seemed uncertain about their authority to intervene. In 1819, when a magistrate tried to prevent a sale in Ashbourne, Derby, he was pelted and driven away by the crowd. Later, he admitted his uncertainty. As to the act of selling itself, I do not think I have a right to prevent it, because it rests upon a custom preserved by the people of which perhaps it would be dangerous to deprive them by any law for that purpose. Some local officials actually encouraged the practice. Poor law commissioners responsible for maintaining the destitute in workhouses sometimes forced husbands to sell their wives rather than having the parish support separated families. In 1814, Henry Cook was compelled by the Effingham workhouse authorities to sell his wife rather than have the parish maintain her and her child. She was taken to Croydon Market and sold for 1 shilling, with the parish paying for the journey and a wedding dinner. The symbolic power of the marketplace location can't be understated. Markets were where livestock changed hands, where property was bought and sold, where the community gathered to witness transactions. By choosing these locations, the participants were inserting their personal drama into the most public commercial space available. They were demanding that their community witness and validate what the law refused to recognize. But the symbolism cut deeper than mere location. The halter around the woman's neck made explicit what the law only implied, that wives were property, no different from animals. Some sales even priced women by weight, just like livestock. This wasn't metaphor, it was the logical extension of legal doctrine. The practice began to decline in the 1840s as social attitudes shifted and divorce became slightly more accessible. Newspaper coverage grew more critical, describing sales as disgusting and disgraceful scenes. The rising middle class, increasingly uncomfortable with such public displays of what they saw as working-class barbarism, pushed for prosecutions. By the 1850s, more sales were conducted privately by deed rather than public auction, as participants tried to maintain the legal fiction while avoiding public shame. Religious and social reform movements also worked to suppress the custom. The Salvation Army and other evangelical groups preached against it, though ironically in 1889, a member of the Salvation Army sold his wife for 1 shilling in Hucknall, Nottinghamshire. Even reformers couldn't entirely escape the practical constraints that made wife selling seem like a reasonable solution to impossible situations. The last recorded wife sale in England took place in 1913, when a woman giving evidence in a Leeds police court claimed she had been sold to one of her husband's workmates for £1. By then, the practice was a relic, kept alive more by tradition and desperation than by any belief in its legitimacy. But the deeper horror of wife selling wasn't the ritual itself. It was what the ritual revealed about the society that made it necessary. These weren't savage customs practiced by barbarians. They were the logical response of rational people trapped in an irrational system. When the law offers no remedy for an intolerable situation, people create their own remedies, however grotesque. The women who stood in those market squares with halters around their necks weren't victims of their husband's cruelty alone. They were victims of a legal system that refused to recognize their humanity. They were trapped between the legal fiction that they didn't exist and the practical reality that they had to find ways to survive, to escape abuse, to seek happiness. Some found that escape through the degrading theatre of wife-selling. They endured the humiliation of being auctioned like livestock because it offered something the law denied them, a second chance. For a few shillings and the price of their dignity, they could legally become someone else's property, and perhaps if they were lucky that someone else would treat them as a human being rather than a possession. The crowds that gathered to watch these sales weren't simply entertainment-seeking voyeurs, though entertainment was certainly part of the appeal. They were witnesses to a community's attempt to solve problems the law couldn't or wouldn't address. They were participating in a form of rough justice, a way of making public what private law kept hidden. Arthur Munby witnessed what he called the fine old custom in a North Yorkshire village in February 1860. An old man sold his considerably younger wife to a middle-aged purchaser for 18 pence. The buyer had thought about making a bid and at length decided that the act was proper and lawful. But the villagers disagreed. They burnt the pair in effigy on the green, suggesting that even in communities where wife-selling persisted, it was controversial and morally complicated. The practice crossed class lines more than Victorian middle-class commentators wanted to admit. The Duke of Chandos reportedly bought his second wife from an ostler around 1740, paying half a crown for a woman his innkeeper was beating. The Duke had her educated, married her after her first husband died, and by all accounts they lived happily together. Her deathbed speech to her household, telling them her history and drawing from it a touching moral of reliance on providence, suggests that even aristocratic wife-selling could lead to genuine love and respect. These stories complicate our understanding of what wife-selling meant to the people who practiced it. Yes, it was degrading and humiliating. Yes, it treated women as property in the most literal way possible. But it was also, in its twisted way, a form of liberation. It offered escape from marriages that might otherwise have meant lifelong misery or death. The historical record suggests that many wives actively participated in arranging their own sales. In Plymouth in 1822, a woman provided the money for her agent to buy her out of her marriage. In numerous cases, wives insisted on sales when their husbands had second thoughts. They weren't passive victims being traded against their will. They were active participants in the only form of divorce available to them. This doesn't make the practice any less horrifying, but it helps us understand why it persisted for over 2 centuries. Wife-selling wasn't just about men disposing of unwanted wives. It was about families trying to solve impossible problems with the only tools available to them. The broader context makes the practice even more tragic. This was an era when a working man might earn 10 shillings a week, when families lived in single rooms with no running water, when children as young as 6 worked in factories for 12 hours a day. Life was brutal, short, and offered few choices. Marriage, which for the wealthy might offer companionship and social advancement, was for the poor often just another form of economic arrangement. When that economic arrangement failed, when husbands drank away the household money, when wives couldn't bear children, when violence made home life unbearable, the poor had nowhere to turn. The church offered moral guidance but no practical solutions. The law offered punishment but no relief. Only the rough justice of community-sanctioned wife-selling offered a way out. The newspaper accounts of these sales, written primarily by middle-class journalists for middle-class readers, often drip with condescension and moral outrage. They describe the participants as brutish and degraded, the crowds as savage and voyeuristic. But between the lines, we can read stories of desperate people making impossible choices with as much dignity as they could muster. When we look back at wife-selling from our modern perspective, it's easy to focus on the cruelty and degradation. The image of a woman with a rope around her neck being auctioned like livestock strikes us as the ultimate symbol of female oppression. And it was, but it was also something else. It was a community's attempt to create justice where the law offered none. It was desperate people's way of claiming agency in a system designed to deny them choices. It was rough, imperfect, often cruel, but it was also the only form of divorce available to the poor. The practice died out not because society suddenly became more enlightened about women's rights, but because legal divorce became slightly more accessible and because changing economic conditions gave women other options. The Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 began to chip away at coverture, allowing wives to keep their earnings and inherit property. Slowly, very slowly, the law began to recognize that women were people rather than property. But for the women who stood in those market squares in the early 19th century, with halters around their necks and crowds pressing close to examine them like livestock, those changes came too late. They lived in a world that offered them no legal identity, no right to their own earnings, no escape from violent or miserable marriages except through the degrading theatre of public sale. Their stories remind us that progress isn't inevitable, that legal rights we take for granted were hard-won and came at enormous cost. They remind us that when systems fail to provide justice, people will create their own forms of justice, however imperfect or morally troubling. As you sit in your comfortable modern life, with your legal right to divorce, your ability to own property, your recognition as a full person under the law, remember the women who bought their freedom for a few shillings and the price of their dignity in the market squares of Victorian England. Remember that the rights you enjoy were built on the suffering of women who had no choice but to wear halters around their necks, and hope that anyone would treat them more kindly than the law did. The last echoes of those market square auctions died out over a century ago, but they leave us with uncomfortable questions about the systems we've built and the people those systems fail. They remind us that behind every grotesque historical practice, there are human stories of survival, desperation, and the endless search for something better, even when that something better comes at an almost unbearable cost. The horror of wife selling becomes even more visceral when we examine the specific mechanics of how these auctions unfolded. Picture yourself back in that market square, but this time as an observer in the crowd. The morning mist hasn't yet burned off the cobblestones, and the air carries the familiar sense of a livestock market, hay, manure, and the metallic tang of fear that emanates from animals sensing their fate. But today, the fear comes from a different source entirely. The woman standing on the makeshift platform isn't cattle or sheep. She's someone's daughter, someone's mother, someone's sister. Her name might be Elizabeth or Sarah or Mary. Names lost to history except in faded newspaper clippings and court records. She's 28 years old, let's say, with work-roughened hands and a face that might have once been pretty before poverty and hard living carved lines around her eyes. The halter around her neck isn't decorative. It's thick rope, the kind used to lead horses, and it chafes against her skin with every movement. Her husband, soon to be her former husband, holds the other end with the casual grip of a man who's done this before, though his hands shake slightly from the morning ale meant to steady his nerves. "Come now, gentlemen," he calls out, his voice carrying across the square with practiced authority. "What'll you give for this fine piece of woman flesh? She's strong as an ox, can work 16 hours without complaint, and she's got all her teeth." He forces her mouth open with calloused fingers, displaying her teeth to the crowd like a horse trader showing off his merchandise. The gathered men press closer, their breathing visible in the cold air, their eyes calculating. They're not monsters, they're farmers, labourers, tradesmen who understand value and practicality. They examine her hands for calluses that prove she can work. They look at her hips to judge if she can bear children. They study her face to determine if she's comely enough to warm their beds on cold nights. One man, a blacksmith by the look of his soot-stained apron, steps forward and pinches her arm to test the firmness of her flesh. "She's a bit thin," he observes clinically. "Might not last through a hard winter. What's her temperament like? Is she given to fits or melancholy?" "Sweet as a lamb when she's treated right," the husband responds quickly. "Never raises her voice, does exactly as she's told. Good with children too, raised 3 of her own without losing a one to fever." But we can see something in the woman's eyes that contradicts this description. There's a hardness there, a calculating intelligence that suggests she's anything but the docile creature being advertised. Her lips are pressed together in a thin line, and her hands, though bound, show white knuckles from clenched fists. She's not the passive victim this scene suggests. She's a participant, playing a role in a drama that might be her only path to freedom. The bidding begins tentatively. 2 shillings, calls out a cattle deal. Ra, more to test the waters than from serious interest. The amount draws scoffs from the crowd, barely enough to buy a decent meal. 2 and 6, counters a young farmer, his face flushed with excitement or embarrassment. He's perhaps 25, with the awkward demeanour of someone who's never been married and sees this as an opportunity to acquire a ready-made household. The woman's eyes dart to him, sizing him up quickly. Is he cruel? Does he drink? Will he beat her on Saturday nights when the ale makes him mean? In these few seconds, she's making calculations that will determine the rest of her life. 3 shillings. The voice comes from the back of the crowd, from a man she recognizes, Thomas Miller, a widower who's been visiting her in secret for months. Relief floods her features so quickly that several observers notice and nudge each other knowingly. This isn't a random auction, it's theatre, a performance designed to give legal legitimacy to an arrangement already made. But the young farmer doesn't understand the choreography. 4 shillings, he calls out eagerly, genuinely believing he's competing for a wife. And I'll throw in a pig. Now the woman looks genuinely frightened. This isn't part of the plan. Thomas Miller frowns and steps forward. 5 shillings, he says firmly, his voice carrying a warning that the younger man seems to miss entirely. 6. The farmer responds immediately, caught up in the competitive spirit. The crowd murmurs appreciatively, this is better entertainment than they'd expected. The woman tries to catch her husband's eye to signal that something has gone wrong, but he's counting money in his head, calculating how much ale and gin 6 shillings will buy. For the first time, real terror crosses her face. She could end up with a stranger, someone who might be crueler than the husband she's trying to escape. 7 shillings, Thomas Miller says through gritted teeth. It's more money than he has, but he can see the woman's distress. The young farmer hesitates, patting his pockets. 7 shillings plus a pig represents a significant investment. He looks at the woman again, really studying her face for the first time, and something in her expression finally penetrates his romantic fantasies. She's not looking at him with gratitude or even resigned acceptance. She's looking at him with the kind of fear usually reserved for rabid dogs. 7 shillings and 6 pence, he says, but his voice lacks conviction now. The auctioneer, the husband, senses the shift in mood. He's drunk enough to be greedy, but not drunk enough to miss the dangerous tension building in the crowd. Wife selling depends on community acceptance, and crowds can turn ugly when they sense something isn't right. Going once for 7 and 6, he calls out quickly, hoping to end the auction before it spirals out of control. 8 shillings, Thomas Miller says desperately, though everyone can see he doesn't have that kind of money. The moment stretches out like a held breath. The woman stands frozen between her current misery and an unknown future, while 2 men bid for the right to own her as completely as they might own a horse or a table. The crowd watches with the fascination of people witnessing something that's simultaneously entertaining and deeply disturbing. Then something unexpected happens. The woman speaks. I choose Thomas Miller, she says clearly, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet square. I'll go with him willingly, but I won't be sold to no stranger like a sack of grain. The crowd erupts in murmurs and arguments. This isn't how wife selling is supposed to work. The woman doesn't get to choose. That's the whole point of the auction format. But there's something in her voice, a dignity that commands respect even in this degrading situation, that makes several men nod approvingly. The lass has spoken, calls out an old man from the edge of the crowd. Let her go to who she wants, this ain't a cattle market. But I bid highest, the young farmer protests, though he sounds relieved rather than disappointed. The husband looks around nervously. He's lost control of his own auction, and the crowd's mood is shifting in ways he doesn't understand. Wife selling works because the community accepts it as legitimate, but legitimacy depends on following certain unspoken rules. One of those rules, apparently, is that the woman's preferences matter. 7 shillings from Thomas Miller, he announces quickly, cutting his losses. And she goes willing, so there's no arguing with the bargain. Thomas Miller steps forward with money he's borrowed from 3 different neighbours, his face flushed with relief and embarrassment. The halter is formally transferred from husband to new owner, though Thomas immediately removes it from the woman's neck and throws it aside with obvious distaste. The crowd applauds, as if they've just witnessed a satisfying conclusion to a dramatic performance which, in many ways, they have. The woman, let's call her Sarah, curtsies to the crowd with more dignity than anyone present deserves, then takes Thomas Miller's offered arm. But as the crowd begins to disperse, we can see the true cost of this happy ending. Sarah may have escaped one bad situation, but she's now legally bound to Thomas Miller as completely as she was to her first husband. If Thomas turns out to be cruel, or becomes a drunkard, she'll have no more recourse than she had before. She's simply traded one form of legal slavery for another, hoping that her new master will be kinder than her old one. The young farmer who nearly bought her watches them go with confused feelings. Part of him is disappointed. He'd been lonely enough to think purchasing a wife was a reasonable solution to his problems. But part of him is also disturbed by what he's just witnessed. He'd never really thought about what it would mean to own another human being, to have someone bound to him not by love or even mutual benefit, but by a legal fiction that reduced her to property. The husband, Sarah's former husband, pockets his 7 shillings and heads for the nearest tavern. Already calculating how many drinks he can afford, he feels a mixture of relief and loss that he doesn't quite understand. Sarah had been a burden, certainly, another mouth to feed, another person making demands on his limited resources, but she'd also been the only person in the world who cared whether he lived or died, even if that care was mixed with fear and resentment. This particular scene is fictional, but it's built from dozens of documented cases that follow remarkably similar patterns. The reality of wife selling was both more complex and more heartbreaking than the simple narrative of men disposing of unwanted wives suggests. Consider the case of Mary Ann Price, sold in Merthyr Tydfil in 1837. The newspaper account describes her as a young woman of prepossessing appearance who was led into the market with a new rope around her waist. She was sold to a man named Lewis for 4 shillings and 6pence, but the transaction was clearly arranged in advance. Lewis was described as her sweetheart, and the sale was conducted with the apparent satisfaction of all parties. But buried in the newspaper account are details that suggest a deeper story. Mary Ann's husband was described as a collier, a coal miner, who had been much addicted to drink. The sale took place during a period of severe economic depression in the Welsh mining districts, when families were struggling to survive on reduced wages and irregular work. Mary Ann's choice to be sold was likely the choice between starvation with a drunken husband and survival with a man who could provide for her. Or consider the more disturbing case from Carlisle in 1832, where a woman was put up for sale by her husband but refused to accept any of the bidders. The crowd grew hostile when she continued to reject potential buyers, and the situation became so tense that the local magistrate intervened to prevent violence. The woman was ultimately knocked down to a man she'd never met for 3 shillings, but she refused to go with him. The sale was declared invalid, and she was allowed to return to her husband, though what happened to her afterward isn't recorded. These cases reveal the fundamental contradiction at the heart of wife selling. The practice depended on the legal fiction that women were property that could be transferred at will, but it also depended on the woman's consent for community acceptance. A wife who was clearly being sold against her will generated sympathy and sometimes intervention from crowds who might otherwise enjoy the spectacle. The geographic distribution of wife selling tells us something important about the social and economic conditions that made it seem necessary. Yorkshire, with its industrial towns and rural poverty, had the highest number of documented cases. The practice was less common in the prosperous south and almost unknown in Scotland, where different legal traditions provided other options for unhappy couples. In the industrial north, where traditional social structures were breaking down under the pressure of rapid economic change, wife selling offered a way to adapt old customs to new circumstances. Factory work meant that families were no longer economic units working together on farms. Husbands and wives might work in different industries, have different schedules, and develop separate social networks. When marriages failed under these pressures, traditional remedies like community intervention or family pressure were less available. The symbolism of the halter reveals the deep connections between wife selling and livestock trading, but it also served a practical legal purpose. English common law recognized several ways of transferring property, and the physical handling of goods called livery of seisin was one of the most ancient and respected methods. By using a halter and conducting the sale in a marketplace, participants were invoking legal traditions that went back to medieval times. The halter also served a psychological purpose for both sellers and buyers. For husbands, it made explicit what the law already implied, that their wives were property to be disposed of at will. For buyers, it symbolized their new rights and responsibilities. For the women themselves, the moment when the halter was removed often marked their psychological transition from one household to another. Some of the most elaborate wife sales involved multiple transfers of the same woman. In Sheffield in 1842, a woman was sold 3 times in one day as different men bid for her and then changed their minds. Each time she had to endure the humiliation of being examined by potential buyers, only to find herself back on the auction block when the transaction fell through. The newspaper account describes her as becoming increasingly distraught as the day wore on, finally breaking down in tears when the 3rd sale was also cancelled. These multiple sales reveal the fundamental instability of the entire system. Because wife selling had no legal basis, there was no way to enforce the contracts or resolve disputes. A buyer who changed his mind could simply return his purchase and demand his money back. A woman who found her new situation intolerable had no recourse except to convince her new husband to sell her again. The children of sold wives occupied a particularly tragic position in these arrangements. Sometimes they were included in the sale price, like accessories to the main purchase. A woman sold in Pontefract in 1847 came with 3 children, and the buyer agreed to take responsibility for their upbringing and education. But more often, children were left behind with their fathers, separated from their mothers by transactions they were too young to understand. The emotional impact on these children doesn't appear in most historical records, but we can imagine the trauma of watching your mother, led away with a rope around her neck by a stranger who had just purchased her. Some children never saw their mothers again. Others were reunited years later under circumstances that must have been awkward and painful for everyone involved. The practice of wife selling also had profound effects on the communities where it occurred. These sales were public events that drew crowds of hundreds, sometimes thousands of spectators. They became forms of popular entertainment, but they also served as community discussions about marriage, morality, and the limits of acceptable behavior. The crowds that gathered for wife sales weren't passive observers. They were active participants in a form of rough justice. They could approve or disapprove of particular sales, intervene when they felt a woman was being treated unfairly, and use their collective voice to enforce community standards. A husband who tried to sell his wife to someone the community considered unsuitable might find his auction disrupted by hostile spectators. These community interventions reveal that wife selling wasn't simply a matter of individual choice or desperation. It was embedded in complex social networks and moral economies. The practice could only function when it had community support, and that support was conditional on following certain unspoken rules about fairness, consent, and respectability. The declining social status of wife selling in the mid-19th century reflected broader changes in British society. The growing middle class, with its emphasis on domestic privacy and moral respectability, was increasingly uncomfortable with public displays of working-class marital breakdown. Newspapers began describing wife sales as disgusting exhibitions and brutal spectacles, language that reflected the class anxieties of an era when industrial capitalism was creating sharp distinctions between respectable and disreputable behavior. Religious revival movements also played a role in suppressing the practice. Evangelical Christianity, with its emphasis on the sanctity of marriage and the moral reform of the working classes, viewed wife selling as evidence of spiritual corruption that needed to be eliminated. Methodist and Baptist preachers regularly condemned the practice from their pulpits, though their success in changing behavior was limited. The legal system's response to wife selling evolved slowly and inconsistently. Before 1850, prosecutions were rare and penalties light, usually a few days in jail or a small fine. But as social attitudes hardened against the practice, courts began imposing harsher sentences. By the 1860s, men convicted of selling their wives could face 6 months in prison, and buyers could be charged with conspiracy to commit adultery. However, proving that a wife sale had actually occurred was often difficult. The participants had strong incentives to deny that any money had changed hands, or to claim that the ceremony was simply a joke or theatrical performance. Juries, often drawn from working-class communities where wife selling was still understood if not approved, were sometimes reluctant to convict people for what they saw as attempts to solve impossible problems. The emergence of music hall entertainment in the mid-19th century gave wife selling a new cultural life, even as the practice itself declined. Popular songs like The Sale of a Wife turned the ritual into comedy, portraying the husband as a fool, the wife as a shrew, and the buyer as a dupe. These songs sanitized the real desperation and humiliation of wife selling by transforming it into harmless entertainment for middle-class audiences. But the persistence of wife selling in popular culture reveals something important about its psychological and social functions. The practice addressed deep anxieties about marriage, property, and gender relations that didn't disappear when the ritual itself became socially unacceptable. Music hall songs, penny novels, and later cinema continued to explore themes of marital breakdown and reconstruction that wife selling had once addressed directly. The international dimension of wife selling also deserves attention. English settlers brought the practice to American colonies, where it persisted into the 19th century. Colonial court records document cases from Connecticut to South Carolina, suggesting that the custom was adaptable to different social and economic conditions. In some American contexts, wife selling seems to have been even more commercialized than in England, with formal bills of sale and newspaper advertisements. The French were particularly fascinated by English wife selling, seeing it as evidence of British barbarism and moral corruption. French newspapers regularly reported on English wife sales, often exaggerating the details for dramatic effect. Political cartoons showed John Bull leading his wife to market like a cow, using the practice as a symbol of English brutality and commercialism. This international attention was deeply embarrassing to English elites, who were trying to position Britain as the leader of European civilization and moral progress. The idea that Englishmen routinely sold their wives like livestock contradicted the emerging Victorian ideology of domestic respectability and female virtue. Government officials began pressuring local magistrates to crack down on the practice more vigorously. The role of alcohol in wife-selling cannot be overlooked. Many sales began in taverns, fueled by drink and male camaraderie that made the degradation of women seem acceptable or even amusing. The ritual often ended with all parties drinking together to celebrate the transaction, a practice that helped normalize what might otherwise seem shocking or cruel. But alcohol also provided a convenient excuse for men who later regretted their actions. Several documented cases involve husbands who sold their wives while drunk and then tried to reclaim them when sober. The legal system generally refused to recognize these post-sale regrets, treating wife selling as a binding contract regardless of the seller's mental state. The economic dimensions of wife selling become clearer when we examine it alongside other forms of working-class survival strategy. In communities where unemployment was chronic and wages barely sufficient for survival, marriage was often an economic necessity rather than a romantic choice. Women needed male protection and support. Men needed domestic labor and childcare. When these economic partnerships failed, wife selling provided a way to rearrange resources and responsibilities. The prices paid for wives reflected these economic calculations. Women who were described as good workers, skilled at valuable trades like spinning or brewing, commanded higher prices than those whose labor was less valuable. Age, health, and childbearing capacity all affected market value. The haggling that surrounded these sales reveals that participants understood exactly what they were buying and selling, not just a woman but her labor, her fertility, and her domestic skills. The documents that survive from wife sales often contain revealing details about working-class life and values. Newspaper accounts describe women's clothing, their physical appearance, their skills and temperaments. They record the words spoken during sales, preserving fragments of working-class speech and attitudes that rarely appear in other historical sources. These documents also reveal the elaborate etiquette that surrounded wife selling. There were proper ways to conduct a sale, appropriate venues and times, acceptable forms of payment. Violating these customs could result in community disapproval, or even violence. The practice may have been degrading, but it wasn't chaotic. It followed rules that participants understood and generally respected. The decline of wife selling after 1850 wasn't simply the result of legal pressure or social disapproval. Economic changes were making the practice less necessary and less practical. Factory employment gave women some economic independence, reducing their absolute dependence on male support. The growth of urban areas provided more opportunities to escape bad marriages through simple desertion. The expansion of the railroad network made it easier to disappear and start new lives in distant places. Changing attitudes toward marriage also played a role. The romantic ideology that was spreading through all levels of society emphasized love and mutual affection as the proper basis for marriage, making the commercial aspects of wife selling seem increasingly repugnant. The emerging women's rights movement, though still small and largely middle class, provided alternative frameworks for thinking about gender relations and female autonomy. The last documented wife sales in England took place in the early 20th century, by which time they were widely seen as relics of a barbarous past. The 1913 case in Leeds involved a woman who claimed her husband had sold her to a workmate for £1,000. But the circumstances were murky, and the community response was entirely negative. There was no crowd of spectators, no public ceremony, no sense that this was an acceptable way to resolve marital problems. By then, legal divorce was available to the working classes, though still expensive and socially stigmatized. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1923 would soon make divorce more accessible to women, providing legal remedies for some of the problems that wife selling had once addressed. Social welfare programs, though limited, offered alternatives to the stark choices that had once made wife selling seem reasonable. The legacy of wife selling extends far beyond its historical time frame. The practice reveals fundamental tensions about gender, property, and personal autonomy that continue to shape contemporary debates about marriage and divorce. It demonstrates how legal systems can fail to address human needs, forcing people to create their own solutions that may be morally troubling but practically necessary. Modern readers might be tempted to view wife selling as evidence of historical barbarism, proof that we've progressed beyond such crude forms of gender oppression. But the practice was the product of specific legal and economic conditions that created impossible choices for desperate people. The women who participated in wife sales weren't passive victims. They were active agents trying to improve their circumstances with the limited tools available to them. The fundamental question raised by wife selling remains relevant today. What happens when legal systems fail to provide adequate remedies for intolerable situations? Contemporary examples might include undocumented immigrants who can't access legal protections, or abuse victims who can't afford legal representation, or families torn apart by economic policies that prioritize abstract principles over human welfare. The crowds that gathered to watch wife sales weren't simply seeking entertainment. They were participating in community discussions about justice, morality, and the limits of acceptable behavior. In our more privatized society, we've lost some of the mechanisms that allowed communities to intervene in individual tragedies, but we haven't eliminated the tragedies themselves. As we close this exploration of one of history's most disturbing customs, we return to that market square where our story began. The woman with the halter around her neck, standing on the platform while strangers bid for the right to own her, represents thousands of women who faced impossible choices in a system designed to deny them agency. Some found happiness in their new arrangements, genuine affection with partners who treated them as human beings rather than property. Others discovered that changing masters didn't change the fundamental nature of their enslavement. All of them paid a price in dignity and self-respect that no amount of practical benefit could fully compensate. Their stories remind us that progress isn't inevitable, that the rights and protections we take for granted were built on the suffering of people who had no choice but to work within systems that denied their humanity. They remind us that behind every historical practice, however repugnant it seems to modern eyes, are human beings trying to survive, to find love, to create meaning in circumstances that offer few good choices. The halters are gone now. The market squares have been converted to shopping centers. The legal systems that once treated women as property have been reformed. But the deeper questions remain. How do we create systems that serve human needs rather than abstract principles? How do we ensure that progress reaches everyone, not just the privileged few? How do we build societies where nobody has to choose between dignity and survival? The women of Victorian England who wore halters around their necks and hoped for kinder masters deserve better than to be remembered simply as victims of historical barbarism. They deserve to be remembered as human beings who faced impossible circumstances with whatever courage and agency they could muster, who found ways to survive and sometimes even thrive in a world designed to crush them. Their voices echo across the centuries, reminding us that freedom isn't free, that dignity isn't guaranteed, and that the price of justice is eternal vigilance against the systems and circumstances that reduce human beings to property. In remembering their stories, we honor not just their memory, but our obligation to ensure that such choices never again become necessary. The market squares are empty now, but the questions they raised about human worth, legal justice, and the price of survival remain as urgent today as they were 2 centuries ago. In that urgency lies both warning and hope, warning that progress can be reversed, and hope that understanding the past can help us build a more just future.